I'm Dick Bland, and I am retired from the forest products industry in California. Yeah, I was born in San Francisco, raised in the Oakland area, went to Oakland High School, and it was somewhere in the junior year, I think, when I thought about something about forestry. I knew I didn't want to be in an office. I knew I didn't want to just have a mundane job. I wanted to do something different. And so I thought forestry, maybe that's what it's about. And I didn't know an awful lot about it. All I knew about was the U.S. Forest Service. I didn't really know there was an industry that hired foresters or anything. And by the time I got into the senior year, it still appealed to me. I did toy with civil engineering. I even toyed with becoming a captain of a merchant ship, of all things in the world. But anyway, forestry kind of was it. And living in Oakland, of course, Cal wasn't very far away there in Berkeley. And in those days, it was pretty easy to get into Cal. It isn't like it is now. As I remember, if you were in the top 10% of your high school class, we pretty much automatically got into Cal. And I do remember it was $37.50 a semester in those days, which I think appealed to a lot of people. I also checked out Oregon State University. They had a great, well-known forestry program. A buddy of mine got a full-ride football scholarship. So we went up there one time for a visit. I had an old beat-up World War II Jeep, and we drove to Corvallis, which is a story in itself. And I was impressed with that school, but the out-of-state tuition was $500 or $600, and so that wasn't going to fit. So I stayed local and did go to Cal to take forestry. That first summer, when I got out of high school, I managed to get a job with the Forest Service in a blister rust program. And that amounted to digging gooseberries out. You know, you got millions of acres of national forest land, and I don't know who came up with the idea, but to traipse over all these acres digging out gooseberries to protect the young sugar pine, which certainly was a noble endeavor, no question about that. But gooseberries were the alternate host, and so we would tromp up and down and dig the gooseberries out, and the ones that were too big to dig out, we would squirt with a little chemical, and we'd go from there. And as I recall, it was 50 cents an hour. But I got a 10-cent raise because I guess I was a good digger, and pretty soon I was running the strings to keep everybody in line, and so they didn't miss any of the gooseberries. So anyway, that was my career start, at least as far as the Forest Service was concerned. I went back to school then as a freshman, and of course, lower division, it's a lot of general education, no real forestry classes. Then between the freshman and sophomore summers, I got another job with the Forest Service. This time it was pruning trees. And this was on the Tahoe National Forest. The gooseberries were on the El Dorado. But on the Tahoe Forest, we went around and pruned trees up 16 feet. The theory being that this would allow the tree to put on this clear lumber for future harvesting, which is worth a lot more than, of course, if it's full of knots. I don't know if that ever was really tested out. That was a pretty wild theory, but anyway, that's what I did that summer. But towards the end of that summer, and we were in a camp with a Forest Service cook, the food got really bad. And, we were all 18, 19-year-olds and thought, we really knew how the world ran. So we decided to go on strike. And we wouldn't go out and prune any more trees until the food got better, was our pitch. And that was one morning. Well, that afternoon, a fellow by the name of Bob Dasman, who I ran into a lot later, and we never did mention this, he came in from the forest office and fired us right on the spot. Well, we got a real lesson how the world really works. Of course, it didn't bother us too much because it was kind of at the end of the summer anyway. But he also dropped the bomb, and don't think you're ever going to work for the Forest Service again. Well, at least to me, I didn't know there was anything besides the Forest Service. There was a California Division of Forestry, but I didn't want to run around putting out fires all the time. So I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. But anyway, ignorance of youth is great. And so I went back to school and for the sophomore year. Now, during your sophomore and junior years at Cal, you go to summer camp, which was in Meadow Valley up in Tuolumne County. And you spend pretty much the whole summer there. And interestingly enough, the Korean War started that June, and I had two really good buddies. They were also in forestry camp, but they had signed up for the Marine Corps Reserve some time before. Well, they only lasted about a week at summer camp, and they were gone. And one of them was Hank Schwartz, who ended up being the forester for Fibreboard up in the Truckee property. And also he was the key to developing the North Star ski resort, both the development of it, and then he managed it for a number of years. And as far as I know, Hank is still up there, and we were good friends at the time. Anyway, after that experience, I went back to school a junior year, and there we got a little more exposure that there was such a thing as a forest products industry, and as it turned out, a good thing. Along the line that winter, I got to be friends with a man by the name of Jim Nicholas, who was also a Cal graduate, several years older than I was, but we got to be good friends right off the bat in some fashion. And his name comes up a little later on because he helped me get some jobs and one thing and another. But I was looking for a job for that summer when I was a junior, and he was working for a consulting forester, Myron Zeke Wall in Sacramento, very well-known private forester, consulting forester. And he said, why don't you talk to Zeke and see if he won't hire you for the summer. I said, well, how do I get a hold of him? Well, he said, go up to the logging conference in Reading and introduce yourself. And he said, let's see what you can do. Well, I did that, and he hired me. And that summer, I ended up at Forest Hill for the Forest Hill Lumber Company, which is a relatively small, kind of a ragtag outfit. The big player in the area was American River Pine, and Hank Abraham was the woods guy for that operation. So I got to meet Hank. Now his name comes up later on in this discussion also. So I made some key friends there just inadvertently. But anyway, working for Forest Hill Lumber Company, Jim Nicholas by that time had gone to work for them and was running the woods, and I ended up out in the woods in the logging, worked on the landing, and in fact one of the jobs I had was scaling logs. Anyway, I'm working on the landing, and I'm supposed to scale the logs so the Jippo truckers get paid the right amount. Well, fortunately, I'd had just a little exposure to log scaling at summer camp, and it was a good thing because I had these guys these drivers looking over my shoulder constantly about, why did I measure it that way? Why did I make that deduction? You know, you got a big rotten center in the log and you got to make a deduction. Well, they didn't think that was right because they were going to be hauling that rod anyway. Well, anyway, that went back and forth. But I survived that, and at the same time, I was a knot bumper on the landing, cutting off the knots. And as I remember, for some reason, a chainsaw on the landing wasn't on a high priority list. So I can remember, I think we had taken an axe to most of these big pine limbs, and that was a workout. Well, finally I got off the landing and went out into the brush and set chokers and so on. And in fact, I had a tin hat. Everybody wore tin in those days. There was no plastic hats in those days. There was a tin hat, and I of course had one. And somewhere or other, a nubbin got thrown over the log and hit me on that tin hat and put a dent in it. And I wore that tin hat for the next 40 years. And I still got that hat with that dent in it to remind me, you know, you got to be lucky sometimes and not just good. So anyway, that was that summer, and that was my first exposure to the forest products industry. And so went back to school. And let's see, Jim Nicholas comes in the picture again. He helped get me a job up at the Cal Ski Lodge. They had a ski lodge up on Donner Summit. And he got me able to get a job up there during the Christmas, New Year's holidays, working in the kitchen. I don't know, cleaning pots and pans or something. Totally unskilled, I'm sure. And so I'm working up there, and it's New Year's Eve. And sitting out there in the empty dining room are two girls. And I picked one out and did my best to see what could be done there. And well, we went out for New Year's Eve and we dated, and we've been married 64 years this year. So that was a pretty good choice, I think, huh? Anyway, back in school, and let's see, that was this is the senior year I'm in now, and graduated in 1952. Korean War was going on. It was just automatic. If you could walk and see a little bit, why, you were in the service right away. I mean, either waited and drafted or you're signed up. Well, I joined the Marine Corps, went to boot camp, and then I went to platoon leaders class where they tried to make second lieutenants out of you. The Marine Corps in those days was always short of second lieutenants, so they had a special program for second lieutenants. And after that, I was sent to Camp Pendleton to join the 4th Marines, the 3rd Division. I was only there a couple of weeks when the whole division was going to move to Japan. And interesting, I've never read anything about this, but you recall in 1952, right in there, 53, the French were getting kicked around in Vietnam and getting overrun. And I'm thinking, why would they move 20,000 men in the 3rd Marine Division to Japan? Because they didn't really need them in Korea in those days. If it wasn't to someday get ready to go to Vietnam. Well, of course, nothing ever came of it. But I always wondered why you'd make that move for a whole division like that. Anyway, that has nothing to do with anything here. But we got the orders to ship out, and Audrey and I had been engaged for some time, and had a big wedding planned that fall in a nice little church in Berkeley, and with the whole 9 yards. And so I called her up and I said, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, and if you want to get married, we better do it. Well, there's a little hemming and hawing around, but anyway, she committed to do that, and here I'm down in Camp Pendleton, she's up in Piedmont, and we got all kinds of new troops coming in to fill out the platoon and so on. So I had a lot of things to do besides arrange to get married. But some way or other, I managed to get a church and get a place to stay and so on. And so the following Saturday, we did get married in a nice Episcopal church by a very nice minister. And we had a week together. And then the following Saturday, I was aboard ship headed over the Near East. I was in Korea, and then I came back in November of '54. I was gone 14 months. And it was a kind of an adjustment coming back because I'd been with all men for 14 months, and all of a sudden you got to clean things up a little bit. But anyway, I did come back, and I had a job right away. Myron Wall, who I told you about, had some connections with the Placerville Lumber Company, and so I knew ahead of time I had a job. And most people would come back from Korea, they'd take a couple of weeks off or a month and do what they wanted to do. But a job to me was really important because I was raised during the Depression, and I can remember my dad talking about a job, how important that was. And so I didn't take any vacation. I went to work, and we got an apartment over a garage up in Pollock Pines, which at the time was a gas station, a bar, and a little independent store. That's all it was there. Nowadays, you got a big shopping center and everything. Well, we had this little apartment over this lady's garage, and she stacked a lot of green white fir firewood in the garage. Well, the smell of green white fir permeated that little apartment. And Audrey was a city girl anyway. Pollock Pines was like the end of the world to her. So we only lasted there a month or two, and we moved down to the big city of Placerville and then spent the rest of our time there. But anyway, I was working for Placerville Lumber Company, owned by Harvey West Sr., who spent a lot of money on good works. He built schools, he built Legion halls, he built churches. He was a very generous guy. And then his two sons, Harvey Jr., who I worked directly for in the woods, and then Bob West, who was the sales manager. Anyway, and they had the mill was at Fresh Pond, which if you go by it today, you would never know there'd been a sawmill in there because, it's a restaurant and gas station now. But anyway, so I stayed there 2.5 years. It was in the early in 1957 when all of a sudden some cruisers showed up from the Winton Lumber Company, which was a big mill over at Martell near Jackson. And it became very apparent that Placerville Lumber Company was going to be no more very quickly. By this time, I not only had a wife, but I had also a little girl. So I thought, I have to do something here. I actually went over to Martell and talked to Warren Carlton, who ran the woods for them, about a job, and they didn't have anything. I heard about a job over in near Sonora for Pickering Lumber Company, and so I tried to check that out a little bit, and I knew they had a railroad, a logging railroad of all things, logging camps, and a big mill for big logs and sort of thing. So, but anyway, I wasn't choosy. I needed a job, and so I got a hold of folks at Pickering, and darn if Hank Abraham isn't one of the top managers over there at the time. And so I went over and I was interviewed by him and also Frank Momeyer, who was the president and general manager. And after a period of waiting and wondering what's going to happen, I did get hired. So in May of '57, I moved over to Tuolumne County, Standard. Now this was a whole different world when you start talking about logging railroads, logging camps, very conservative management, didn't want to change much. I was the second forester they ever had. Hank Abraham was the first, and he got promoted up to mill manager, mill superintendent. And so I took his job in the woods. They had a beautiful, beautiful timber property. Still had a lot of old growth. They had big sugar pine and ponderosa and big white fir too. It just was unreal. And their stands ran 50, 60,000 feet per acre, huge stands. But it was an old line outfit, and change was going to be difficult if indeed any change was needed. I was a new kid on the block, and I had learned over the years you kind of walk kind of softly to start with, because you don't want to get into a war with anybody when you're brand new. So I worked my way in there, and pretty soon, even in the logging camp, I was invited to sit at the blue table, which is all the top bosses in the woods. I mean, there was a process in that logging camp of etiquette and so on that is a whole nother story. But anyway, my intent at the time was we had these huge stands, big timber, which is a no-brainer on what to cut. But my initial objective was protect the young stuff. And so I worked with the bull bucks and the logging superintendents and side rods, and we pretty well got it. So the fallers would look out for the young stuff. Cat skinners, when they were skidding logs, would look out for the young stuff. And like I said, they had 60 or 70,000 feet to the acre. Well, we ended up leaving up to 15, 20,000 the acre of good, young, thrifty trees to grow. And they were protected. And some years later, we came back and we logged in there again. So, and in those days, it was all selective logging too. We did virtually no clear cutting in those early days because we had plenty of the big timber. So, and the sawmill was not set up for small logs anyway. So, it all just kind of came together. But anyway, they were Pickering management was committed to this railroad logging. Now they didn't send the logging equipment right out into the woods. They had a transfer landing at Soap Creek, and they would truck the logs to Soap Creek and then transfer them onto rail and then make the 55 some mile haul into the mill at Standard. And the logs, I remember the trucks coming in there, we had a lot of 3 log loads, and which, isn't that extraordinary in those days, but these were trucks with 12-foot bunks instead of 8-foot bunks. And you get a 3 log load on a 12-foot bunk, you got some real wood. And there would just be one after another. That timber was that good. So we, anyway, it was obvious they weren't going to ever consider doing anything different than to use the railroad. Though I wrote a paper to the president of the company recommending, trying to promote getting rid of the railroad and get back on the truck, get on trucks, highway trucks, get out to the highways and so on. And it was a very cold reception. That wouldn't work because there'd be all kinds of accidents and this, that, and couldn't do that for whatever reason and so on. And the inefficiency of this was just remarkable because you had this big logging camp at Soap Creek, about 200 people, plus a family town, plus plumbers and carpenters and electricians to keep everything running. They had another camp over in Beaver Creek, 60 or 70 men. And by this time we had the west side property, and they had a big camp out at Clavey River. Plus you had these railroad camps, bridge crews, rail gangs, all this to keep the railroad going. plus car shops to work on the cars and so on. So there was just an awful lot of people involved. Well, there's a lot of strong feelings about eliminating jobs, obviously, but it seemed almost a very common sense that a company couldn't survive doing that because all the competitors are already converted, and you can't run railroad tracks out into a Forest Service timber sale, and our timber wasn't going to last forever, so there had to be some changes. But anyway, nothing changed, and in fact, at one point, right towards the end, before the company sold, they bought a brand new railroad shovel for decking logs. I thought, by this time I'm getting real frustrated and wondering, where are we going? Because by this time, I've been there about 7 years, and I was getting kind of restless. But by this time, I've got 2 girls plus a wife, and again, job was very, very important. So I was sticking it out. At the camps, well, yeah, well, they were cleanup. Yeah, there's pictures and stories about the old days and so on. And of course, mostly they were tramp loggers moving one camp to another, and no such thing as families and so on. Well, the modern camps that we had, there was a family town, and it's cleaned up and kept neat and so on. And families would come up for the summer with the kids, and there was always a swimming hole, and there was this and that, and it was nice. It was a good community, and people helped each other. The camp itself was basically, of course, for single men, and it always had a good cookhouse, good food, and all that. And the families, if they wanted groceries, they could order them, and then they'd bring them up. In fact, they had a daily wagon that would come up and bring new men in and groceries and take fired men out. So there was always a rotation there. So, and the camps were kept up, and they were pretty strict. I don't remember excess drinking, it was kind of weird when you think about it, because I'm sure on weekends when they left camp, why, all kinds of wild things were going on. But during that week, of course, they're tired out, I guess, from working, but I don't remember much trouble or even much noise or anything after dinner. Why, it was kind of over, and and like I say, in the cookhouse, there was a real protocol. You sat in certain places, and if somebody wanted you to pass something, you passed it, and you didn't take it, you passed it. That was serious violation of the protocol. And when the platter was empty, it always went back down to the end of the table. And if it didn't, that was a bad thing. And it was amazing for guys that, pretty much, I guess you say uncouth, not to be an elitist over it, but these guys were working guys, worked hard, and but there was a code, I guess you'd say. There was a real code of what you did and didn't do. So it was kind of interesting. It was kind of a little civilization of its own, Well, a lot of different characters in those camps, I'll tell you that. I used to stay in them a couple nights a week, so I got to know a lot of guys. There's one individual, a guy by the name of Fred Houck, Houck. He wasn't the logging superintendent, number one. He was the number 2 guy. They called him camp boss. He kind of really ran things. And then the side rods were under him. But Fred Houck, he totally uneducated. Well, I'd been through high school. But anyway, he'd been with Pickering since the early 40s or late 30s. And he really cared for the trees. I was so fortunate because of him, because when I wanted him to take better care of the young trees, he was the man, because he gave the orders. I mean, I'm kind of a staff guy. I don't pull any weight. Fred Houck did. And underneath this rough exterior, and he was a big guy, about 6'6" or something, big guy. He really bought in. He knew it. He knew it ahead of time. I mean, and that's one reason we never clear cut. I think that's one of the reasons anyway, but we didn't need to. But anyway, Fred was really a real forester at heart, and he helped me a lot in getting things done. And in fact, after we eliminated the company logging and everything, I kept him on as kind of fire patrol and quality control guy around the contract loggers, measure and log, make sure the logs are cut right, and because he had total respect for them too. He really had the credentials. So Fred Houck, I would say, was one of the remarkable people. Out of chronological order, there's one thing I would like to mention that I don't think I've ever mentioned it before to many people. But when I was the forester for Pickering, we had 8,000 or 10,000 acres of undivided interest land, which means that two parties and one cannot do anything unless the other one agrees. And this was some of our best timberland. The other party lived back on the East Coast, and they weren't interested in forestry or lumber, just kind of interested in money. Well, at the time, Pickering had bought the first cut. In other words, they'd paid the other interest for one cut. So, the bean countertypes will say, well, cut everything you can. Cut it all if you can. Well, you can't cut it all because you've got state rules, and but they wanted a real heavy cut. Well, what was wrong with that was that a lot of small trees, the mill we had wasn't set up for small trees. But more important, I felt that sooner or later, Pickering, or whoever had the mill at the time, was going to buy out that other interest. So why scalp the land when that's going to eventually has to happen? Those people on the East Coast, are really having interest in it. They can get paid off. So of course I was in charge of selecting the trees to be cut, and I didn't do what I was told. And I don't know it doesn't make any difference now, but I don't know as I ever really talked to too many people about that, because it was kind of sensitive. But actually, in the logging end of the thing, we had the company logging then. One or two people that were in the management of the logging knew what I was doing and supported me. That makes sense. They didn't want to scalp it either. And so that Ducey land ultimately was purchased, and it's some of the most productive land that we had at the time. So that was one thing that took place, and you could lose your job real fast over something like that. But anyway, it seemed to work out. It's 1965, and I'm getting restless, as I mentioned. But all of a sudden, two buyers show up. Fibreboard Wood Products, a big pulp mill in Antioch, and they had a sawmill up in Truckee, and some timber holdings up there. And the second was Bill Pendola, Yuba River Lumber Company in Nevada County. He had the expertise. He was a real good operator, and Fibreboard had the money. So that was going to be the partnership. And I didn't really know these people, but I had a good friend, Joe Griggs, who's now with Robinson Timber, who worked for Bill Pendola at his mill up in Nevada County, and he clued me in that this was one good man, good manager, great guy to work for. So I thought, well, that's hopeful, you know. Anyway, the day comes when my job is to take Bill Pendola out to the woods. And I thought, well, this is good stuff. You know, maybe this is going to work out, maybe not. Anyway, he took him out, gave him a tour of the property, the good stuff and the not so good stuff, and so on. And during that ride, he said to me, if you were running these woods, what would you do? And I launched onto my big spiel about shutting the camps down, shutting the railroad down, putting the highway trucks in service, go on the highway, get the logs to the mill the most efficient way you can, and contract the logging. Now, that was another big thing because we had hundreds of guys working in the woods. I'd contract the logging out, have contract truckers, and that's what I would do, Bill. He didn't say anything. I don't know, whatever. So anyway, that day was over, and then a period of time, it takes a while for these things to work through. But anyway, by late that year, darn if Pickering didn't sell out to the Fibreboard Yuba River Partnership. And Bill came in as the president, I guess you'd say, and he hired a good general manager, John Lowe. And then as soon as he came in, I don't know, the first or second day, he called me in his office and he said, do it. And that, of course, by far is the greatest challenge of my life. It's one thing to talk those kind of changes, but to actually do it. Because the first thing I had to do was fire or terminate, I guess is a better word, all the people we had in the woods. You know, all the camp bosses and everybody, the cooks, everybody. We shut everything down. And and the same thing with the railroad. We don't need a railroad anymore. So, you know, that's the first thing I did. Then the real problem came, what was I going to replace it with? Had some real hectic days that winter. There were a couple of local loggers in the area that were been around for a while and were pretty good, but I needed more. Because we were logging maybe 130 million a year at the time, and I had to get some more loggers. So up at the logging conference that winter, made some contacts, hired some guys, and got them down there. And by come spring, we were ready to go. Unfortunately, one of the loggers I hired tried to commit suicide. These are the little sidebars. Another one got in a fight downtown Sonora and got his jaw broken and ended up in the hospital. But and these were our logging contractors, and I thought, ooh, this is going to be interesting. Well, anyway, it all worked out. Everybody got back, and everybody went to work, and we did. Now, not everybody, but a lot of people said it'll never work. He said you'll have logs scattered all over Highway 4 and Parrots Ferry. In those days, it was a lot narrower road and steeper than it is today by far. And we were logging the Beaver Creek coming out through Dorrington, going down Highway 4 for a lot of it. Some of the rest of it, we were coming out of Soap Creek across Beardsley Dam. But anyway, it worked. And I had the best job in the industry. I think I don't know what other jobs are like, but I know I had the best job that I could possibly imagine. Because Bill Pendola, and incidentally, he left after 4 or 5 years, got a big hoofah with Fibreboard, and they bought him out. But anyway, he gave me complete reign of the woods. He said, your job is to make sure we never run out of logs at this sawmill. I said, okay. And it came close a couple of times, real close. But we never did run out. Of course, we had a lot of our own timber as well. We bought a lot of Forest Service timber starting just about then. I had to staff up forestry department because I was still the only forester they had, and with all these logging contractors to supervise, and the harvest plans were just starting to come in with the state, and so we needed a lot of expertise along those lines, line surveying and all kinds of the forestry things, log buying on the outside. So I needed a staff, and there again, I was really lucky. I got these guys, and somebody told me once, always hire guys that are smarter than you, and I managed to do that. That wasn't too hard, but these guys were unbelievable. Total commitment, would do anything, and extremely sharp, bright, and committed to their jobs. And some of the outstanding ones, of course, Bill Snyder was chief forester. Unbelievably bright, and a lot of this was before the computers came in. This was a lot of hand calculating and so on. But and Chris Conrad and Tom Lales, Leon Manich, Will Durrell, Travis Huntley. There was any number of them, and some of them left over the years, but most of them stayed right to the bitter end. I really was fortunate to have a crew because you didn't have to tell them what to do. Just tell them what the results were. They go out and do it, you know. For example, the California spotted owl. There was the northern spotted owl, which shut down the industry in Oregon and Washington, but there's a California spotted owl, which was getting close to doing that in the Sierra. And the dogma of the Forest Service and the experts on the spotted owl was they had to have old growth. If they didn't have old growth, they would become threatened, endangered, and disappear from the earth. Well, we thought we knew a little bit better, and we didn't have. By this time, we didn't have a lot of old growth left. Mostly it was second growth, and Chris Conrad organized the effort, and we had a team of our guys that would go out. They'd do their work during the day, and then at night, this is how committed these guys are. They go out and spend half the night out there with a box full of stinking mice and hoot for these owls. And of course, the idea is you put the mouse on the stump, and the spotted owl comes down, and then you map where the spotted owl is. See, well, as it turns out, our mapping of the spotted owls we had on our property, primarily in second growth timber, was every bit as dense as the Forest Service did, if not more so. And we had these old maps, and incidentally, when that information was presented to some of the so-called experts, totally rejected. We didn't have any PhDs doing this. All we had was dirt foresters. What did we know? Well, we knew enough that to this day, we know something about California spotted owls. But anyway, that's a sidebar, but it showed the commitment of our forestry crew, what they did in finding out where our spotted owls were. Anyway, after the owl thing, let's see, we got Fibreboard and Yuba River had the company. Yuba River got bought out. Fibreboard ran it. 1975, Louisiana Pacific bought Fibreboard. And Fibreboard had several mills up in Oregon by this time, a couple in California, including Pickering. Wasn't called Pickering anymore, but and so Louisiana Pacific came in the picture, and that's a whole different story too. The way Louisiana Pacific was run, they centralized things pretty much. The California main office was in Red Bluff, and Harry Merlo, of course, was a well-known name, was the head of Louisiana Pacific. And things I remember about those days weren't the best. Once a month, we'd all get in one of his jets, and we'd fly someplace for a big monthly meeting. And you could just about record it as it was the same thing every time. And Harry jumping up and down and telling us we weren't doing a job and all that stuff. But anyway, a few of us got kind of used to it, and we'd sit there and roll our eyes at each other and kind of get a kick out of it. But but Louisiana Pacific pretty much left us alone because we were a ways away, and so we still ran the woods the way it was, and so on. So I survived that change. And then, Fibreboard had a real asbestos problem. During the war years, they manufactured asbestos insulation. And of course, everybody then claimed to get emphysema and asbestosis and so on. And so there were these huge lawsuits, and Fibreboard was really on the verge of bankruptcy. They're being sued not for millions, but for billions of dollars. Everybody that ever worked in a shipyard or changed a brake pad on a car claims to be exposed to this asbestos. A lot of what was produced by Fibreboard. But anyway, so Louisiana Pacific figured they had enough of Fibreboard, so they spun them off because they didn't want to be tainted with all these lawsuits. So it must have been in about 85. They spun Fibreboard back off. So Fibreboard became an independent corporation again, and had their offices down in Walnut Creek, Concord, I guess it was. And so we survived that. So I survived a number of corporate changes, and in between times, a lot of different plant managers and so on. My wife Audrey says the only reason you survived is because you were the only one who knew the way to the woods. And in that may be fairly accurate, because nobody really messed much with the woods that came in. And so I knew how to go there and get back, and so I survived all that. But then in 95, Sierra Pacific came in and bought the Fibreboard mills, and that's when I retired. And it was in the fall of 95. Yeah, they have a different organization than we had. Instead of having one person in charge of the woods, they have it split up. We depended heavily on the Forest Service timber sale program. And like I say, we needed about $130 million a year, and our land we could really produce about 35 or 40, somewhere in there. So the rest we had to make up on Forest Service timber sales or other small private properties, which it never did amount to much. So we were very active in the timber sales business. I think during those years, we probably logged more than 2 billion feet of Forest Service timber, different timber sales in various sizes. So that became a very important part of the job, because we couldn't supply the mills if we didn't buy the timber. So on timber sale days, when you'd go down to the supervisor's office and the bidders would arrange themselves around the table and so on, those were gut wrenchers. I took it really personal. If I couldn't buy a timber sale, there was something wrong. And I was bidding against some pretty good friends too, because we were all good friends in the industry. And they weren't friends there for a couple hours, I'll guarantee you that. But we were fairly successful. Good portion of the time it was oral bidding, where you could match the opponent's bid till somebody dropped out. And then some of the times it was sealed bidding, which was really deadly. Either left a lot of money on the table, or you didn't get the sale, or whatever. But when you had a good sale day, I could really feel good for a few days after it was done. Now I'd done the job. It was very important. That was such a key job. That's what it was all about, keeping that timber supply. Of course, then as it got into the 90s, the timber sale program began to tail off, and of course it's in pretty pitiful shape right now. But those were hard-working days, and we had some big fires that we logged. In 1987, I had this Stanislaus Complex fire, 150,000 acres, and it was contained on a Wednesday, and I think by Monday we were hauling logs and salvaged our own first. But the Forest Service performed very well. That was in the fall of '87, and by the spring of '88, they had timber on the market. Great performance. Just paying more than the other guy. What leads into that is location. Maybe we have a cheaper haul. If there's a sale right up the highway here, and somebody from Placerville bids on it, we got a real advantage. And so all the appraisals work into it, but when it really comes down to it, how bad do you need it? And I've always ran the numbers, what the break-even point is and all that stuff, and showed it to the manager and said, yeah, okay. But if you really needed it, I've many times gone above it. And in some cases, smart move. All of a sudden the market might pick up and you look like a hero. Or you could be a dummy because it goes the other way. But you paid too much. Why did you do that? Well, but those are the kind of things, you got to make those snap decisions. And so it isn't something you can do by committee. You either got to do it. You got to do it. You need it. You really need it. And we paid too much for some, and others we've had real good prices. So it was be a game of wits, I guess. And yeah. We had some big strikes. The mill was unionized. In fact, the woods were unionized when they had the company logging crews. But the mill was always unionized in those days. And there was a big strike in 60 or 61, I forget. In fact, that's when the West Side sawmill, which we had bought, suspiciously burned down during the middle of the strike. Of course, took all these jobs with it, and it was never rebuilt. But anyway, that strike, incidentally, was over 5 cents an hour. And it went 11 and a half months. It was strictly an ego trip, I'm sure. I know the Pickering management were just, we're not going to give an inch. And the union leadership, safe, they couldn't lose face, settled. 11 and a half months. And somebody figured this out, that they'd have to work 100 years to make up the difference or something, what they lost. So it was stupid on both sides. But there was a lot of bad feelings. Well, there was a couple of us. I was the only forester in 60, but there was a few other guys from the woods management that weren't in the union, that we went into the plant and unpiled lumber and loaded some boxcars. But then there was another big strike, and this one was really bitter. It was Louisiana Pacific had us, and that would have been in the late 70s, I think it was. And that went, I forget how long, but it went on. And of course, Harry Merlo, he wasn't going to give an inch, and the locals, they weren't going to give an inch, and so I don't know. They finally did compromise at some point, but by that time we had, fairly decent forestry staff, and so we did go in the plant. And there were some bad feelings from some of the strikers going through the lines and all that stuff. But time heals a lot of wounds, and well, life goes on. So anyway, I left in '95, and actually I thought, well, I'll be a consulting forester. That sounds good. So I got some business cards printed and some envelopes, and I got all that stuff. Got my name in the phone book. First client I had was a lawyer. Had a lawsuit. Some guy on a helicopter landing got killed when a log rolled off a truck and hit him in the head. Anyway, the lawyer was on the defense side, and he hired me to read through 3 big boxes of depositions. Good money. Best money I ever made in my life. All I do is read this stuff, clock the hours. I thought, I'll make a lot more when we go to trial. Well, it was settled out of court. So my second client was a guy who thought he had some timber someplace down there. And I went out and looked at it, so on. Didn't have much. Never paid me. So I'm only batting 500. About that time, I'm thinking, I don't know if I want to do this anyway. So anyway, there was an opening on the County Board of Supervisors. And so I ran for supervisor, and it was an open seat, and there were 5 of us running. And I thought, well, I'll just win this thing outright, because I'd had the most experience. I'd been the longest term resident here, and so on. I had good support, great support. I thought, we'll just win this in the March primary. Spent a lot of money. Did not win. Didn't come close to winning, so there had to be a runoff that fall. Well, I finally did win that, but naive, You're never going to win against 5 people. So anyway, I served 4 terms, 16 years on the Tuolumne County Board, and finally figured I'd had enough, and so I left that. And so like I say, we've been in the county since '57, so that's 60 years, and raised 4 children here, went through local schools, all went on to different colleges. I have 11 grandchildren, and I don't know what I spend my time doing, but anyway, that's my story. Timber issues didn't really have a top priority. Well, they did at some point when the Forest Service was not selling what they should be selling, and we try to stir the pot and try to get, and in fact, we made some trips back to Washington, and we did, try to advocate for a better timber program and so on, and at the regional level. But main controversies were over land use, a lot of it zoning and who can build where and all that kind of stuff. And people get really passionate and emotional, somebody wants to do something in their backyard or something. But you got to follow the law, and which we always try to do. And so those are some of the main issues. And people are easy to take pot shots, but you got to follow the law, and there's certain state requirements for the protection of oak trees, for example, or endangered species. And so we had to be tight on those things and follow the law, and that's what we tried to do. Yeah. No, the opposite's true. Tuolumne County has lost population in the last, even before the last census. Not a lot, but 1 or 2%, and they're, last I heard, they're barely holding even now. Big drop in the school-age children and young families because of the type of employment that's available. So there was a big push in the '70s for subdivisions and in the urban forest interface and all that, above Twain Hart and Long Barn. But I think that's pretty well leveled off. So there's not a big push to move to Tuolumne County right now, that's for sure. Well, I think one-on-one, I hate all this email and all that stuff now. Mainly because I'm totally illiterate on. I can do email, but I can't do much more. And I think that depersonalizes. If you got a conflict with somebody, I mean, there's nothing like sitting down and having a cup of coffee or a beer and seeing where each other are coming from. And you may not resolve it, but at least, you've given it your best shot. So that doesn't work in all cases, of course, but, if you can use that, it's a way to get a lot of things done just over a handshake, As anything really formal conflict, although I've been on committees, industry, Forest Service committees regarding interpretation and development of the timber sale contract. I did a lot of that for the timber industry. And like I said, made some trips to Washington and so on, but I don't know, internally with the team we had in the woods, I don't think we ever had any conflict. As far as the logging contractors were concerned, they knew what they had to do. They knew I was fair, and there were certain things they could do and couldn't do, and they liked working here, and so they all kept their nose clean, And I don't think we ever had any real serious violations of the law. There's always a few things. The road gets dusty, and the Forest Service raise the hell, or in the CDF when you used to have to fall all the snags. There might be one snag left up on top of that ridge, 3/4 of a mile away, and the inspector would come out. You will get that snag. Of course, that's changed. Now they want the snags left. And I'm thinking of all the times those saws were packed up that hill to cut one snag. Times have changed. Yes. Trust. Mutual trust. And I mean that among all different people. Making deals, sometimes over the phone without a handshake. Making arrangements that, today the lawyers would go nuts. Some of the deals we did, I mean, big things, but we knew each other. Trust. I trusted that individual, he trusted me, and what a difference that made. What a difference in efficiency. You don't bring the lawyers in, you go out and you make a deal. Here's what you got to do. What do you think it's worth? Here's what we'll pay. Okay, not okay, whatever. Matter of trust. I don't know. I'm out of the loop. I don't work there anymore. From what I hear, I don't think there's a lot of that, or as much. There must be some, but as much as there was 40, 50 years ago. Yeah, I joined, I think, the time I graduated, I think wasn't there maybe a student discount or something, if I remember right. So as a student, I took the discount and joined. And I've never been in a leadership, or I've never really been that involved. I used to love to go to the chapter forest forums. I think a lot of them were called, and, both in Placerville and over here we had a fairly active group. And early on, I used to go to the annual meetings down in Oakland, or I think some of them were in different places. So I'd go there, and I'd get the Journal of Forestry and I'd read it. And early on, there were some things that were kind of interesting, but then it kind of got way beyond. I wasn't in that anymore. I was running things. I didn't have time to worry about cruise standards and all of this, all the range finders and all. I don't know anything about that. So, but anyway, I paid the dues to get the magazine, and once in a while there'd be an interesting letter to the editor. I'd like to read those and see what people thought. Yeah, well, TUCARE, Tuolumne County Alliance for Resources and Environment. We got to go back to 1989. Sierra Club and some of the other enviros were qualifying an initiative for the statewide ballot that would have really gutted the ability to manage private timberland. They had already kind of screwed up the Forest Service. Now they were working on the private land, and it was going to place a lot of restrictions on how you could manage your private land. And this was going to be a statewide initiative, and it was well financed. Well, the industry, through I think it was the California Forestry Association, or was it the Timber Association at the time, one or the other, before they changed names. Anyway, the meeting, what are we going to do about this? Brought the strategist in and said, you'll never beat it head on. What you must do is qualify a competing initiative. Basically, confuse people, screw it up. You'll never convince people to vote against the Sierra Club just head on, but offer an alternative, and you might do it if you have enough money. So, long story anyway. So the strategy was to develop these local groups up and down the Sierra, Redding and over on the coast, and Lassen County and south of here, and anyway, in Tuolumne County, we formed TUCARE. Yeah, and the idea was to get people to support forest management, basically, yeah, and not directly involved in the initiative process because they're a nonprofit and all that, but to just get the local community on board that this, we needed to manage our forests and so on and so forth. And so it became an education tool, and to this day, they take school kids out on tours of the woods, and not just forestry, but cattle ranching and hydropower and all the resource uses, and that's what they do. Yeah, it's one of the few that's left too. I think there might. I don't know whether one up in Shasta County still there or not. But anyway, there are very few, if any, left other than one we have here. Well, I'm on the County Planning Commission right now, and at one time, before I was a supervisor, I was on the County Board of Education, 30 years. But it was easy in those days. It didn't have all this militancy and, Anyway, those were easy days. Let's see. Well, Sierra Cascade Logging Conference, past president, logger of the year in 1990. I was on the board of directors for a number of years of California Forestry Association, which is a new name, but yeah. And there was a California Forest Protective Association keyed to private land that merged with the Forestry Association some years ago, and I was on that board for a while. So I don't know, those are the main ones. I try to stay active on that stuff. That's one of the reasons I was so fortunate that I had the flexibility where I could get out and do these things, Nobody really knew what I was doing, but anyway, that was all the better because I could go to these meetings and I could do these kind of things as long as I had somebody behind me taking care of business, which I always had quality people. But because that's really where a lot of the action is these days, is getting out there with the policymakers, and you can be the best forester in the world and grow the best trees and everything else, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't have the ability to deal with it. So I was really fortunate being able to go to these different meetings and taking part in boards of directors, and I encouraged the guys under me to do that. I really did. Yeah, I don't say it was a requirement, but I really encouraged to be active in local groups or licensed forestry associations or whatever there was, and make time for it. And a lot of them did, yeah. Oh, I hit it in the good years. Things, the industry in particular was beginning to hire foresters, and there's still some good jobs around. Sierra Pacific has a great staff of highly qualified, very bright foresters. They have a lot of them, and I'm sure there are other companies. They're of course the big player in the state, but up north. But it's tough to get a job with the industry. We've got 2/3 fewer sawmills in California now than we did 10 or 12 years ago. So the job availability is tough. Now it all depends what part of it you want to go into. If you want to go in the logging end of it, you can always get a job with a logging outfit and work your way up and maybe go on your own. You can always do that. You don't have to work for a lumber company. But lumber company jobs, if you can land one, are good jobs. Of course, there's always a Forest Service. I mean, I'm biased, but Forest Service and CDF, of course, have some good jobs, pay well, I understand, and good retirement and all that. So I don't know what I'd tell them other than be ready to grind, because that's what you're going to have to do. And you're going to start at the real bottom, below the bottom, probably. Just work your way up. I appreciate the opportunity. I mean, some of these things I haven't thought about, let alone talked about, in 60 years. Some things, and like I mentioned, I not in a venue to talk about them, so it's good to be able to talk, and you didn't even have to ask me any questions. I just talked. When I told my wife I was coming over this thing, she says, "Well, what are you going to do for an hour or so?" I said, "I'm going to talk." She says, "You haven't talked that much in the last 5 years." She's probably right. But anyway, I enjoy talking about those things because there's no place to talk about it. There's nobody. Most of the guys are gone, or there's nobody to talk to about it anyway. And some of I wouldn't anyway. But so anyway, it's been a real opportunity, and I thank you and you, Mark. I do.